A wealthy man invited his humble maid to a high-stakes business dinner to embarrass her. What she did there stunned the entire room. The evening began, as such evenings often do, with an air of veiled intentions. Harold Whitman leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, sipping a glass of bourbon that gleamed amber in the soft glow of his study. The room exuded opulence. Mahogany bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, housing an impressive collection of unread volumes. Harold had everything a man could want: power, wealth, and a loyal entourage eager to validate his every whim. Yet, beneath his polished demeanor was a cruel streak that delighted in the discomfort of others. Tonight, he had a particular target in mind. Maria stood at the threshold, clutching a tray of tea she had just brewed. A petite woman in her mid-30s, her plain features bore the marks of a life of hard work. Calloused hands, a posture slightly stooped from years of service. But there was a quiet dignity about her, an unassuming grace that Harold found both amusing and perplexing. "Maria," he said, his voice dripping with a counterfeit warmth that made her pause mid-step. Come in, come in." She entered cautiously, placing the tray on the glass table before him. "Yes, Mr. Whitman? Is there anything else you need?" Harold's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, there is. I've been thinking, you've worked for me for, 3 years now?" Maria nodded, unsure of where this was going. "Yes, sir. And you've been loyal, hardworking, reliable," he continued, each compliment feeling oddly detached. "So, I thought it might be time to reward you." Her brow furrowed. Harold Whitman was not a man known for his generosity. "Reward me, sir? Indeed. Tomorrow evening, I'm hosting a very important business dinner at the Rosewood Manor. High-profile clients, influential partners, the usual crowd. I'd like you to join us." Maria's mouth fell open slightly before she quickly composed herself. "Me? At a business dinner?" Yes, he said with a wave of his hand, as if the idea were perfectly ordinary. "You've been such a vital part of the household. I think it's only fair you see another side of my world." Maria's instincts bristled. Harold Whitman did nothing without a motive. Still, she couldn't afford to offend him. "I'm honored, sir, but I'm not sure I'd fit in at such an event." "Nonsense," Harold said, his tone firm. "All you need is a nice dress and a bit of confidence. Consider it an opportunity to expand your horizons." She hesitated, searching his expression for sincerity and finding none. "If you're certain, sir." "Oh, I'm very certain," Harold replied, his smile widening. "Let's call it a gesture of goodwill." Maria returned to her modest quarters that night, her mind buzzing with unease. Her room was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Whitman estate. A single bed, a small dresser, and a makeshift bookshelf holding a few cherished novels she read when time allowed. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. What was Harold's angle? A man like him didn't simply invite his maid to a high-profile dinner out of the goodness of his heart. She had seen the way he interacted with people, the calculated charm, the thinly veiled arrogance. This invitation felt less like an honor and more like a trap. Harold's world was a labyrinth of power plays, and she was an outsider walking blindfolded into its depths. Her neighbor, Mrs. Alder, knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. "Maria, dear, you've been quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" Maria explained the situation, her words hesitant, her tone uneasy. Mrs. Alder, a retired seamstress with a knack for reading people, listened intently. When Maria finished, she pursed her lips thoughtfully. "It does sound peculiar," she admitted, "but perhaps it's not what you think. Maybe he genuinely wants to show you some appreciation." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Do you really believe that?" Mrs. Alder chuckled. "No, but whatever his motives, you shouldn't go unprepared. Wait here." She disappeared and returned moments later with a garment bag. "This was mine years ago. A little outdated, perhaps, but elegant. Try it on." Maria hesitated, but eventually relented. When she emerged, the dress fit her like a second skin, its deep blue fabric accentuating her understated beauty. Mrs. Alder's eyes sparkled with approval. She reached into her sewing kit and handed Maria a silver brooch, shaped like a blooming rose. "There," she said, stepping back. "You look like a lady who belongs in any room, no matter how grand." Maria felt a flicker of confidence. "Thank you, Mrs. Alder. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I'll go." "And hold your head high, child," Mrs. Alder said with a grin. "If they're foolish enough to underestimate you, that's their problem, not yours." Meanwhile, in his study, Harold poured himself another drink, his thoughts racing. His business associates would find it hilarious, he thought. The sight of his maid fumbling through conversations with the city's elite would be the perfect icebreaker for the evening. She'd be a living, breathing punchline, and he'd bask in the glow of their laughter. "Maria," he muttered to himself, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Let's see how well you handle the spotlight." He smirked, raising his glass in a mock toast to the spectacle he was already imagining. The thought of his colleagues' amused faces fed his ego. He rehearsed in his mind the lines he'd used to subtly undercut Maria's confidence, ensuring she remained in her place. Little did he know, the events of the following evening would not unfold according to his plan. Maria woke before dawn the next day, her usual routine feeling heavier with the weight of the evening ahead. The sky outside her small window was still a muted gray, and the soft chirping of birds served as a reminder that, for now, the world was calm. But her heart was not. As she brewed her morning tea, her hands trembled slightly, the gravity of Harold Whitman's invitation pressing down on her. "I'm walking into something," she murmured to herself, watching the steam rise from her cup. "But I'll face it." The hours crept by as she went about her daily chores, each task accompanied by a gnawing sense of unease. She polished the silverware in the grand dining room, dusted the intricate chandeliers, and arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases, all the while imagining the kind of people who would gather in those rooms tonight. Wealthy, polished, and powerful. People who would look at her and see nothing more than a maid out of place. Mrs. Alder stopped by again in the early afternoon, carrying a small box. "Maria, I thought you might need this," she said, handing it over. Inside were a pair of silver earrings and a delicate bracelet, their simplicity complementing the dress Maria had tried on the night before. Maria's breath hitched at the sight of the unexpected gift. "Mrs. Alder, I can't accept these," she protested. "Nonsense," the older woman replied, waving a hand dismissively. "They're just trinkets from my younger days. They've sat in a drawer for years. Better they see some light than gather more dust." Maria's eyes softened. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll repay you." Mrs. Alder smiled. "Repay me by showing them what you're made of tonight." As evening approached, Maria's anxiety began to give way to a quiet determination. She slipped into the dress, fastened the silver brooch, and added the earrings and bracelet. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her looked poised, even confident. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. When she emerged from her quarters, she was met with the disapproving eyes of Margaret, the housekeeper. "Well, don't you clean up nicely?" Margaret said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Just remember, you're still the help, no matter what dress you're wearing." Maria bit her tongue and nodded, refusing to let Margaret's words dampen her resolve. She walked toward the waiting car with her head held high, her steps measured and deliberate. The ride to Rosewood Manor was silent, save for the hum of the car's engine. Harold sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, occasionally letting out a soft chuckle. Maria stole glances at him, searching for any clue about his true intentions. His face betrayed nothing but smug satisfaction. As the car pulled up to the grand estate, Maria's breath caught in her throat. Rosewood Manor was a sprawling masterpiece, its marble columns and grand staircase illuminated by the glow of dozens of chandeliers. Luxury cars lined the driveway, and well-dressed guests mingled near the entrance, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Harold turned to her with a smirk. "Ready?" Maria nodded, though her hands clenched tightly around her small clutch. "As I'll ever be." The moment they stepped inside, the noise seemed to double. The grand hall was a symphony of crystal glasses clinking, heels clicking against polished floors, and the murmur of conversations spoken in hushed but confident tones. Maria felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, each glance assessing, judging. She focused on steadying her breathing, forcing herself not to shrink under their gaze. Harold guided her through the crowd, his hand lightly on her back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying an unmistakable air of self-satisfaction. "This is Maria, one of the most hard-working members of my household. She's here tonight as my personal guest." The room grew quiet for a beat, and Maria felt the scrutiny intensify. Then came the polite smiles, the curt nods, the whispered comments exchanged behind raised glasses. She caught snippets of phrases: "Unusual choice," "Bold move," "Is she the entertainment?" Her cheeks flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. Maria's resolve was tested almost immediately. Harold led her to a small group of his business associates, their tailored suits and practiced grins a testament to their status. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, eyed Maria with thinly veiled amusement. "So," he drawled, "Mr. Whitman tells us you're an integral part of his household. What exactly do you do?" Maria's mind raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I manage many of the daily operations. Cleaning, organizing, ensuring everything runs smoothly." The man raised an eyebrow. "Fascinating. And do you find that fulfilling?" Before Maria could answer, Harold interjected, his tone dripping with mockery. "Maria has a unique perspective. I thought it might be enlightening for everyone to hear." The group laughed lightly, and Maria felt the heat rise to her face. But she refused to falter. "Every job has value," she said calmly, meeting the man's gaze. "Even the ones that aren't glamorous." Her response caught him off guard, and a flicker of respect crossed his features before he masked it with another smirk. Harold, however, looked displeased, though he quickly covered it with his signature charm. As the evening progressed, Maria found herself navigating the labyrinth of social expectations with surprising ease. She answered questions thoughtfully, deflected barbs with grace, and even managed to draw a few genuine smiles from some of the guests. Harold watched from a distance, his irritation growing. This wasn't the spectacle he had envisioned. Maria wasn't floundering. She was holding her own. By the end of the night, Maria's confidence had grown. Though she still felt out of place, she had proven to herself that she could rise to the occasion. As she stepped into the car for the ride home, Harold's silence spoke volumes. His plan to humiliate her had failed, and for the first time, she felt a small spark of triumph. Little did she know, the true test of the evening was yet to come. Maria stepped out of the car, her heels clicking softly against the stone-paved driveway of Rosewood Manor. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and freshly cut grass, mingling with the occasional hint of perfume as elegantly dressed guests passed her by. The estate loomed before her, its towering columns and ornate carvings illuminated by the golden glow of hundreds of lights. It was the kind of place she had only read about in books, a world so far removed from her own that it felt almost unreal. Harold emerged beside her, adjusting the lapels of his finely tailored suit. His smirk was more pronounced now, as though he were savoring an inside joke. "Maria," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "tonight's about impressions. Don't disappoint me." Maria's jaw tightened, but she forced a small smile. "I'll do my best, Mr. Whitman." As they entered the grand hall, Maria's senses were overwhelmed. The soft hum of a string quartet filled the space, blending seamlessly with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of conversations. A magnificent chandelier hung above, its thousands of crystals refracting light into tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. The floor beneath her feet was polished to such a shine that she could see her reflection, a figure that looked both foreign and familiar in her borrowed gown. Harold wasted no time immersing himself in the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with an air of practiced charm. Maria trailed behind him, her presence acknowledged with polite nods but little else. She felt the weight of every glance, the subtle up and down assessments of strangers who saw her as an enigma at best, an intrusion at worst. A woman in a floor-length emerald gown approached Harold, her sharp eyes flicking briefly to Maria. "Harold," she said smoothly. "Who's this? I don't believe we've met." "Ah, Victoria," Harold replied, his smile widening. "This is Maria, one of the most dedicated members of my household. I thought it would be enlightening for her to experience an evening like this." Maria extended a hand, her heart pounding. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Victoria's handshake was fleeting, her expression a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. "How refreshing," she said, her tone suggesting anything but. Maria's cheeks burned, but she stood tall. Harold's eyes glittered with amusement as he guided her further into the room, introducing her to more guests who greeted her with varying degrees of skepticism. Each interaction was a test, each polite smile a mask concealing the real thoughts behind their eyes. The dinner bell chimed, and the guests moved toward the dining room, a lavish space adorned with gilded mirrors and towering floral arrangements. Maria's seat was strategically placed beside Harold, but she quickly noticed the subtle hierarchy at play. The most influential guests occupied the seats closest to the head of the table, while she and others deemed less significant were pushed to the periphery. As the first course was served, a delicate arrangement of scallops and caviar, Maria focused on keeping her hands steady. She was hyper-aware of every movement, every glance in her direction. Across the table, a man in a crisp tuxedo leaned toward his companion and whispered something, his eyes flicking to Maria before both of them chuckled softly. She pretended not to notice, but her grip on her fork tightened. The conversation flowed around her, an intricate dance of wit and subtle competition. Harold dominated the room, his voice rising above the others as he regaled the guests with anecdotes designed to elicit laughter and admiration. Maria listened intently, searching for an opportunity to contribute without overstepping. When one of Harold's clients made a passing remark about art, a subject she had quietly studied in her spare time, she saw her chance. "Actually," Maria said, her voice measured but confident, "the piece you're referring to is by Renoir, not Monet." Both were part of the Impressionist movement, but their techniques and themes were quite distinct. The table fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others incredulous. The man who had made the initial comment raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" he said, his tone skeptical. Maria met his gaze steadily. Yes, Renoir focused more on capturing the vibrancy of human interaction, while Monet was deeply invested in exploring light and atmosphere. The nuances are subtle but unmistakable if you know where to look. To her surprise, the man nodded slowly. "Interesting. I hadn't considered that. You have a keen eye." Harold's expression darkened, though he quickly masked it with a laugh. "Maria has a way of surprising people," he said, his tone light but edged with tension. The second course arrived, and Maria found herself more at ease. While the initial interactions had been challenging, she was beginning to navigate the dynamics of the table. She answered questions thoughtfully, deflected veiled barbs with grace, and even managed to draw a genuine laugh from one of Harold's more influential clients. But Harold was not pleased. This was not the spectacle he had envisioned. Instead of faltering under the scrutiny of his guests, Maria was holding her own, even earning subtle nods of approval. His irritation grew with each passing moment, though he hid it well behind his practiced charm. By the time dessert was served, Maria's confidence had grown. The rich chocolate mousse before her seemed almost a reward for enduring the evening's trials. She allowed herself a small smile as she took her first bite, savoring both the flavor and the sense of accomplishment. Harold's voice cut through her thoughts. "Maria," he said, his tone deceptively casual, "tell us, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about working in my household?" The question was a trap, and Maria knew it. But she met his gaze calmly, her mind racing for a response that would satisfy without compromising her dignity. "I've learned," she said slowly, "that people's true character often reveals itself in unexpected ways. Sometimes, it's in moments of kindness. Other times, not so much." A ripple of murmurs spread through the table, and Harold's smile tightened. Maria's words hung in the air, a subtle but undeniable challenge. The evening wasn't over, but the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly in her favor. Maria stood quietly near the edge of the room as the guests filed out of the dining hall, moving in clusters to the adjoining parlor. She felt a momentary wave of relief as the intense scrutiny of the dinner table gave way to the more diffuse energy of post-meal mingling. Yet, her reprieve was short-lived. Harold, ever the master of manipulation, was already orchestrating his next move. He approached her with that same smug smile, the one that always seemed to hint at some unspoken game. "Maria," he began, his voice as smooth as the bourbon in his glass. "There's someone I'd like you to meet?" Maria nodded, her face composed. "Of course, Mr. Whitman." He led her to a small group standing near an ornate fireplace. The centerpiece of the group was an older man with a commanding presence, graying hair, sharp eyes, and a tailored suit that seemed to reflect his authority. Harold clapped a hand on the man's shoulder. "Maria," Harold said, gesturing grandly, "this is Mr. Langston, one of the most brilliant minds in finance. And Langston, this is Maria, who keeps my household running like clockwork." Langston's expression was inscrutable, though there was a faint glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. "Is that so?" he said, his tone neutral. "It is," Harold continued, his voice tinged with amusement. "Maria has a remarkable knack for resourcefulness. I thought she might enjoy hearing about the intricacies of our business world." Maria's heart sank. She understood Harold's strategy instantly. He wanted her to flounder in front of Langston, to reveal her supposed ignorance and provide the evening's entertainment. But Maria, who had spent years quietly observing and learning, was not so easily undone. Langston launched into a discussion of global markets, his voice measured and authoritative. Maria listened carefully, her mind cataloging key points. When he paused, clearly expecting her to stumble, she spoke with a steady calm that surprised even herself. "It's fascinating," she said, "how market trends often mirror human behavior. Fear and greed drive so much of what happens, don't they? It's almost predictable." Langston tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "An interesting observation. What makes you say that?" Maria took a breath, drawing on memories of the books she'd borrowed from Mrs. Alder, her own observations, and the insights gleaned from overhearing Harold's meetings. People crave certainty, but markets thrive on uncertainty. It's why speculative bubbles form. Hope blinds logic. I've seen it on a smaller scale, of course, in how people manage their personal affairs. Langston nodded slowly, his respect for her growing with each word. Harold, meanwhile, was barely concealing his irritation. "I must admit," Langston said, "I didn't expect such insight. Tell me, Maria, where did you pick up this perspective?" Maria offered a modest smile. "Observation, mostly. You learn a lot by paying attention." The conversation shifted, and Maria found herself drawn into a series of discussions with Langston and others. She spoke sparingly but with purpose, her words carrying a weight that made people take notice. Harold's efforts to undermine her were backfiring spectacularly. The more he tried to steer the conversation toward subjects meant to trip her up, the more Maria revealed her quiet intelligence and adaptability. At one point, Harold grew desperate enough to interrupt her mid-sentence. "Maria," he said with forced cheerfulness, "why don't you share your thoughts on something more domestic? Perhaps the finer points of dusting crystal?" Laughter rippled through the group, but Maria remained unflustered. She turned to Harold with a composed expression. "Well," she said, her voice steady, "attention to detail is essential in all things, isn't it? Whether it's managing a household or managing a portfolio." Langston laughed, the sound genuine. "Touché, Maria. Harold, you didn't tell me she was this sharp." "Must have slipped my mind," Harold muttered, his smile tight. The evening wore on, and Maria's confidence grew. She moved through the room with a quiet elegance, engaging in conversations that ranged from the arts to economics. Each interaction chipped away at the preconceived notions of those around her. By the time the party began to wind down, Maria was no longer seen as an outsider but as an enigma, a woman who had defied expectations in the most unexpected of ways. Harold, meanwhile, was seething. His meticulously planned humiliation had turned into an unintentional showcase of Maria's poise and intellect. He watched as Langston approached her one last time, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Maria," Langston said. "I've been in rooms like this for decades, and it's rare to meet someone as unassuming yet insightful as you. You're a remarkable woman." Maria's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. That means a great deal." Langston lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, leaving Maria and Harold standing together. Harold's face was a carefully crafted mask of neutrality, but Maria could see the frustration simmering beneath. "Well," he said, his voice tight, "you've certainly made an impression." Maria turned to face him fully, her expression calm but resolute. "That was the idea, wasn't it?" Harold's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he forced a laugh and gestured toward the exit. "Shall we?" As they walked toward the car, Maria couldn't help but reflect on the evening. Every moment had been a challenge, a test of her ability to navigate a world that was not her own. But she had risen to the occasion, surprising even herself. The realization filled her with a quiet pride, though she knew better than to let her guard down. Inside the car, the tension between them was palpable. Harold remained silent, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Maria sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene. She could feel the shift in their dynamic, the subtle but unmistakable crack in Harold's control. But Maria also knew Harold well enough to understand that this wasn't over. He would not accept defeat lightly, and his next move would be calculated and precise. The thought should have frightened her, but instead, it steeled her resolve. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, just as she had tonight. Maria sat quietly in the parlor as the evening's guests gathered in small clusters, their voices mingling with the soft hum of classical music. The dining room's formalities had given way to a more relaxed but no less scrutinizing atmosphere. Maria could feel the tension of the night lingering in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Harold, ever watchful, was already weaving through the crowd, his practiced charm on full display. She noticed his gaze flick toward her more than once, his lips curving into a smirk that hinted at mischief. Finally, he approached her, his steps deliberate. "Maria," he called, his tone disarmingly pleasant. "Come with me for a moment. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Maria rose smoothly, masking the apprehension that curled in her stomach. "Of course, Mr. Whitman," she replied, keeping her voice even. He led her toward a small group standing near a grand fireplace. Among them was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to assess everyone and everything in his vicinity. His tailored suit was understated but impeccably crafted, a quiet testament to his wealth and influence. Harold stopped beside him and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Maria," Harold began, gesturing toward the man, "this is Mr. Langston, one of the sharpest minds in finance. And Langston, this is Maria, the one who ensures my household runs like a well-oiled machine." Langston's eyes swept over Maria, his expression polite but reserved. "I see," he said, his tone neutral. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Maria." Maria inclined her head slightly. "The pleasure is mine, sir." Harold's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maria has an unusual perspective on things. I thought it might be enlightening for her to join us tonight." Langston's brow lifted slightly, the faintest hint of intrigue flickering across his face. "Unusual, you say?" "Well, Harold, you've piqued my curiosity." The conversation began with Langston outlining his thoughts on the global economy, his tone measured and authoritative. Maria listened intently, her mind cataloging key points and connections. She knew Harold's intent to thrust her into a discussion where she would undoubtedly falter, but she refused to take the bait. When Langston paused, clearly expecting her to stumble, Maria spoke carefully. "It's fascinating," she said, her voice steady. "How much market behavior is driven by emotion rather than logic. Fear and greed seem to dictate so many decisions, don't they?" Langston's eyes narrowed slightly, not with skepticism but with interest. "An astute observation. What makes you say that?" Maria hesitated briefly, then pressed on. "Markets thrive on uncertainty, yet people crave certainty. It creates a tension that often leads to risky choices. I've seen similar patterns on smaller scales, like personal finances, or even household management. The dynamics are remarkably similar. Langston nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Interesting. And where did you develop this perspective? Maria's gaze flicked briefly to Harold before returning to Langston. Observation, mostly. Paying attention can reveal a great deal. As the conversation deepened, Maria's confidence grew. She spoke sparingly but with purpose, her insights earning the group's attention and respect. Harold, meanwhile, seemed to grow increasingly agitated. Every attempt he made to redirect the spotlight back to himself was met with polite but dismissive interest from the group, who seemed far more intrigued by Maria's unexpected depth. At one point, Harold forced a laugh and interrupted her mid-sentence. "Maria," he said, his tone laced with condescension, "perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on something more familiar, like the finer points of dusting crystal?" The group chuckled softly, but Maria remained unflustered. She turned to Harold with a composed expression. "Attention to detail is essential in all things," she said evenly. "Whether it's managing a household or navigating a portfolio, the principle is the same." Langston chuckled, a genuine sound. "Touché, Maria." "Harold, you didn't tell me she was this sharp." "Must have slipped my mind," Harold muttered, his smile tight. As the evening wore on, Maria found herself moving through the room with quiet confidence. She engaged in conversations that ranged from art to economics, each interaction further eroding the guests' initial skepticism. She referenced books she'd read, observations she'd made, and even insights gleaned from Harold's own meetings, knowledge she had absorbed while serving unnoticed in the background. By the time dessert was served, Maria's presence had shifted from curiosity to genuine admiration. One guest, a woman in a sleek navy dress, leaned toward Maria during a lull in conversation. "You've certainly been full of surprises tonight," she said, her tone warm. "Have you ever considered pursuing a career beyond household management?" Maria smiled softly. "I've never thought it was much of an option," she admitted. "But tonight has been illuminating." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you ever change your mind, I know a few people who would be very interested in someone with your perspective." Harold's glass clinked loudly as he set it on the table, his frustration barely concealed. "Maria," he said abruptly, "tell us, what do you think has been the most surprising thing about working in my household?" Maria met his gaze calmly, recognizing the trap in his question. "I've learned," she said slowly, "that true character often reveals itself in the smallest moments. Sometimes it's in acts of kindness. Other times it's in different ways." A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and Harold's expression hardened. Maria's words were subtle but deliberate, a quiet reminder that she understood far more than she let on. By the time the evening ended, Maria felt a quiet triumph settling over her. Harold's plan to humiliate her had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. As they rode home in silence, Maria stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She had not just survived the evening. She had transformed it, leaving behind an impression that would not easily be forgotten. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Harold would not let this night's outcome go unanswered. Whatever came next, Maria resolved, she would be ready. The next morning dawned gray and unremarkable, but the events of the previous evening weighed heavily on Harold Whitman. He sat in his study, the room saturated with the smell of leather and aged wood, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. A storm brewed in his mind. The night's failure gnawed at him, a stark reminder that his carefully constructed plans could, in fact, unravel. Maria had not only defied his expectations, but had also stolen the spotlight. It was intolerable. Across the estate, Maria went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had always defined her. But something had changed. She carried herself with an air of confidence that hadn't been there before. Her interactions with the other staff were polite but resolute, her movements deliberate. Though she had no illusions that Harold would take the previous night's defeat lightly, she also knew she couldn't afford to show fear. Later that afternoon, Harold summoned Maria to his study. She knocked lightly before stepping inside, the thick door closing behind her with a soft thud. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Whitman?" she asked, her voice calm. Harold looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Maria. Have a seat." Maria hesitated for a moment before lowering herself into the chair across from him. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, charged with unspoken tension. "Last night," Harold began, his tone measured, "was unexpected. You certainly made an impression." Maria inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad I could contribute." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Indeed. However, I couldn't help but notice that some of our guests were perhaps too enamored with your insights. It's important, Maria, to remember one's place." Maria met his gaze steadily. "Of course, Mr. Whitman. I have no intention of overstepping." Harold leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "Good. Because I have another opportunity for you to prove your loyalty to this household." Maria's stomach twisted. She knew better than to trust the silkiness of his tone. "What would you like me to do?" Harold's new plan unfolded with the precision of a chess master setting the board. A dinner was being organized for the following week, a smaller, more intimate gathering of his closest business allies. It would be held at his estate, and Maria was to assist in every aspect of its preparation. Harold outlined the details with calculated precision, making it clear that her role would be as much about hosting as it was about serving. "I'll expect nothing less than perfection," Harold said, his voice clipped. "This is a chance for you to redeem yourself." Maria's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I understand, sir." As she left his study, Maria felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. She knew this was no ordinary dinner. Harold was orchestrating something designed to reassert his dominance. But she also knew that she had no choice but to face it head-on. The days leading up to the dinner were a whirlwind of activity. Maria worked tirelessly, coordinating with the kitchen staff, overseeing the arrangements, and ensuring every detail was flawless. Despite the physical toll, she found solace in the rhythm of her work. Each perfectly set table, each polished piece of silverware, was a small act of defiance. If Harold wanted to test her, she would meet his challenge with quiet determination. Harold, meanwhile, watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He occasionally offered veiled comments, "Don't forget who's in charge, Maria," or "You wouldn't want to disappoint our guests again." But Maria refused to rise to the bait. She answered him with calm efficiency, her resolve unshaken. The evening of the dinner arrived, and the estate sparkled with understated elegance. The dining room was a masterpiece of refinement, the table set with crisp linens and fresh flowers, each place setting meticulously arranged. Maria stood at the edge of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching as the guests began to arrive. Harold was in his element, greeting each guest with his signature charm. His laughter rang out across the room as he ushered them toward the table. But his eyes frequently flicked toward Maria, the unspoken reminder of her place never far from the surface. As the dinner began, Maria moved gracefully between the guests, serving with the same poise she had displayed at Rosewood Manor. Her presence was quiet but undeniable, her confidence a subtle defiance that Harold could not ignore. The conversation flowed easily at first, with Harold steering the topics toward his accomplishments and ambitions. But then one of the guests, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor, turned her attention to Maria. "You seem remarkably composed, Maria," Eleanor said, her tone curious but kind. "Tell me, how do you manage such a demanding household with such grace?" Maria hesitated, aware of Harold's gaze burning into her. But she answered with quiet confidence. "It's about understanding people, ma'am. Knowing what they need before they ask and adapting quickly to changing situations." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That's a skill many people in our field could benefit from. Have you ever considered applying your talents elsewhere?" Harold interrupted with a chuckle, his voice sharp. "Maria's talents are best suited to this household. She knows her role well." Maria's cheeks flushed, but she forced a small smile. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to serve." As the evening wore on, Harold's frustration grew. His attempts to undermine Maria were met with polite disinterest from the guests, who seemed far more intrigued by her composure and insights. Eleanor, in particular, appeared captivated by Maria's quiet strength. occasionally directing the conversation back to her. By the time dessert was served, Harold's carefully constructed narrative had begun to unravel. Maria's presence, once intended to highlight her inferiority, had instead revealed Harold's insecurity. His carefully crafted dominance over the evening was slipping away, and he knew it. When the guests finally departed, Harold cornered Maria in the hallway. His face was a mask of barely contained anger. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. Maria met his gaze without flinching. "I'm simply doing my job, sir." Harold stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You've made a fool of me tonight. Don't think for a second that this is over." Maria stood her ground. "I've only ever done what you've asked of me, Mr. Whitman." For a moment, Harold said nothing, his fists clenching at his sides. Then he turned abruptly and strode away, leaving Maria standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. As she watched him disappear, Maria felt a strange sense of calm. She had faced his wrath and emerged unscathed, but she also knew that Harold was far from finished. Whatever he had planned next, she would be ready. The tension in the household simmered for days after the dinner. Maria carried on with her duties, her outward demeanor composed, but she remained acutely aware of Harold's presence. His attempts to undermine her had failed twice now, and she knew he wouldn't let that go unanswered. Harold Whitman was not a man who tolerated losing control, especially not in his own domain. Meanwhile, whispers among the staff hinted at Harold's escalating frustration. They spoke in hushed tones about his long hours in the study, the sharp edge to his words, and the way his eyes followed Maria with a calculating intensity. She dismissed their gossip as idle chatter, but in the quiet moments of her day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The opportunity for Harold's next move came sooner than Maria anticipated. One afternoon, he summoned her to his study with a terse message delivered by Margaret, the housekeeper. Maria found him seated at his desk, a folder of documents spread before him. "Maria," he began without looking up, "I've been invited to a highly exclusive gathering next week. It's a business dinner with some of the most influential minds in the industry. Naturally, I'll need someone to accompany me." Maria blinked, unsure of where this was going. "Of course, sir. Would you like me to assist with the arrangements?" Harold's gaze lifted, a predatory glint in his eyes. "No, Maria. I'd like you to be my guest." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Maria's stomach churned. She knew better than to believe this was a genuine gesture of goodwill. Harold's invitations always came with strings attached. The night of the gathering arrived, and Maria found herself stepping into yet another opulent venue. This time, the setting was even grander than Rosewood Manor. A sprawling estate with gilded chandeliers, marble columns, and expansive windows that offered sweeping views of the city skyline. The air buzzed with energy as men and women in tailored suits and designer gowns mingled, their conversations a low hum of power and privilege. Maria walked beside Harold, her posture straight and her expression neutral. She wore a sleek black dress loaned to her by Mrs. Alder, paired with understated jewelry that belied its modest origins. Harold, as always, exuded an effortless charm, his laughter punctuating the conversations he joined. But Maria could sense the tension beneath his polished exterior. As they entered the dining hall, Harold's hand rested lightly on Maria's back, a gesture that seemed protective to an outsider but felt controlling to her. He led her to their seats, strategically placed near the head of the table, where the most influential guests were gathered. The evening unfolded much as Maria had expected, a display of wealth, power, and subtle competition. The guests discussed mergers, acquisitions, and market trends, their words laced with innuendo and unspoken rivalries. Harold thrived in this environment, navigating the conversations with ease. Maria, for her part, listened carefully, contributing only when addressed directly. At one point, the host of the evening, a formidable woman named Evelyn Sinclair, turned her sharp gaze toward Maria. "You've been rather quiet," Evelyn observed. "Tell me, Maria, what do you think about the challenges facing global markets today?" The table fell silent, all eyes on Maria. She felt Harold's gaze burning into her, daring her to falter. But instead of shrinking under the pressure, She straightened her shoulders and met Evelyn's gaze. "I think," Maria began, her voice steady, "that global markets are often at the mercy of human nature. Fear, greed, and the desire for stability drive many decisions. Understanding those motivations is key to navigating the challenges they create." Evelyn tilted her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "An insightful answer. And what would you suggest as a solution?" Maria hesitated for only a moment before replying. "Adaptability. Markets, like people, are constantly evolving. Success lies in anticipating change and responding with flexibility rather than resistance." A ripple of murmurs spread around the table, and Evelyn nodded approvingly. "Well said." Harold's grip on his wine glass tightened, the only outward sign of his frustration. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. He had expected Maria to stumble, to embarrass herself in front of the most powerful people in the room. Instead, she was holding her own, earning respect from those Harold sought to impress. The turning point came later in the evening, during a discussion about philanthropy. Evelyn, who chaired a prominent foundation, described an initiative to provide microloans to underserved communities. "It's a challenging project," Evelyn admitted, "but we're determined to make it work. The question is finding the right approach." Maria spoke without hesitation, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Microloans are a powerful tool, but they're most effective when paired with education and mentorship. Providing resources is only part of the solution. Empowering people to use those resources effectively creates lasting change." Evelyn's eyes lit up. "That's exactly the perspective we need. Tell me, Maria, have you ever worked in this field?" Maria shook her head. "No, ma'am. But I've seen firsthand how much a little guidance can do." Evelyn leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "I'd like to hear more about your experiences sometime." The rest of the table seemed equally impressed, and Harold's face was a mask of barely concealed fury. Maria had not only succeeded in the evening's test, but had also drawn the attention of someone far more powerful than Harold himself. As the night wound down, Maria found herself standing by the grand windows, gazing out at the glittering city below. Evelyn approached her, a glass of champagne in hand. "You're a remarkable woman, Maria," Evelyn said. "You have a natural insight that's rare in any setting, let alone here. If you ever decide to pursue a career beyond this household, I'd be happy to help." Maria's cheeks flushed, but she smiled gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than I can say." Harold appeared moments later, his expression tense. "Maria," he said sharply, "it's time to go." She nodded, offering Evelyn a polite farewell before following Harold out of the room. As they descended the grand staircase, Harold's silence was deafening. The car ride home was no different, the tension between them thick enough to cut. When they arrived back at the estate, Harold turned to Maria, his face a mask of suppressed anger. "You think you've won something tonight?" he hissed. "This isn't over." Maria met his gaze evenly. "I've never seen this as a competition, Mr. Whitman. I'm just doing what you've asked of me." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. As he stormed away, Maria allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She had faced the lion in his den and emerged unscathed. Whatever came next, she was ready. The morning after the gala dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the towering windows of the Whitman estate. Yet, the brightness of the day did little to dispel the tension lingering in the air. Harold Whitman sat in his study, his jaw clenched as he stared at the untouched coffee on his desk. The events of the previous evening played on an unrelenting loop in his mind, each moment tightening the knot of resentment in his chest. Maria, meanwhile, moved about her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had always defined her. But something about her had changed. Her movements carried a confidence that had not been there before, a quiet dignity that was impossible to ignore. The staff had noticed too, their conversations punctuated by subtle glances in her direction. Maria, it seemed, had become more than just a maid. She had become a symbol of something greater. It was late in the afternoon when Harold finally summoned Maria to his study. She knocked softly on the door before stepping inside, her posture straight and her expression calm. The room was as imposing as ever, its walls lined with dark wood paneling and shelves of unread books. Harold looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Whitman?" Maria asked, her voice steady. "Yes," Harold replied, his tone clipped. "Sit." Maria hesitated for only a moment before taking the chair opposite him. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared history. "Last night," Harold began, his voice low, "was not what I expected." Maria said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "You've proven yourself capable," he admitted begrudgingly. "More capable than I gave you credit for." Maria inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, sir." Harold's expression darkened. "But don't think for a moment that this changes anything. You are still a maid in this household. You would do well to remember that." Maria's gaze didn't waver. "Of course, Mr. Whitman." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, but Harold seemed to deflate slightly, his shoulders sagging as he leaned back in his chair. For the first time, Maria saw something behind his carefully crafted mask, a flicker of vulnerability, perhaps even regret. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy truce. Harold withdrew into his work, avoiding prolonged interactions with Maria. She, in turn, focused on her responsibilities, though her presence seemed to carry a newfound weight. The household staff, once indifferent to her, now treated her with a quiet respect. Even Margaret, the ever-critical housekeeper, seemed to soften, her barbed comments replaced by wary glances. It was during one of these quiet days that an unexpected visitor arrived at the estate. Evelyn Sinclair, the formidable host of the gala, swept through the grand entrance like a force of nature. Her tailored coat and confident stride commanded attention, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Is Mr. Whitman available?" she asked the butler, her voice brisk. Harold appeared moments later, his expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Evelyn," he said, his tone warm but guarded. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm here to speak with Maria," Evelyn replied, her gaze steady. "Is she available?" Harold's composure faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Of course. I'll have her brought here." Maria was summoned from the kitchen, her brow furrowing slightly as she was escorted to the parlor. Evelyn greeted her with a warm smile, gesturing for her to sit. "Maria," Evelyn began, "I wanted to thank you for your insights at the gala. Your perspective was not only refreshing but incredibly valuable." Maria's cheeks flushed. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a great deal." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "I'm not just here to express my gratitude. I'm here to offer you an opportunity." Maria blinked, her heart pounding. "An opportunity?" Evelyn nodded. "I've been thinking about the discussions we had, particularly about microloans and empowerment. I believe you have a unique understanding of the challenges we're addressing. I'd like to offer you a position with my foundation." Maria's breath caught. "A position?" "Yes," Evelyn said with a smile. "You'd start in a support role, of course, but I see great potential in you. With time, I believe you could make a significant impact." Maria was momentarily speechless. The offer was as exhilarating as it was daunting. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Evelyn replied simply. "I can arrange for training and mentorship to help you transition into the role. All I ask is that you think about it." After Evelyn departed, Maria found herself sitting in the quiet of her small room, the weight of the offer pressing down on her. It was a chance to change her life, to step out of the shadow of servitude and into something greater. But it was also terrifying. She thought of Mrs. Alder's encouragement, of the guests who had seen her potential, and of Harold's thinly veiled resentment. The next morning, Maria made her decision. She sought out Harold in his study, her steps firm and her resolve unwavering. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice steady, "I'd like to speak with you." Harold looked up from his desk, his expression guarded. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position with Evelyn Sinclair's foundation," Maria said, meeting his gaze. "And I've decided to accept it." Harold's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Surprise, anger, and something else she couldn't quite place. "You've decided?" "Yes," Maria said firmly. "I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had here, but it's time for me to move on." For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then, To Maria's astonishment, he let out a short, bitter laugh. "You've outplayed me, Maria. I'll give you that." Maria tilted her head slightly. "It was never a game, Mr. Whitman." Harold leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps," Maria replied, "but it's my decision to make." Harold's expression hardened, but he said nothing more. As Maria turned to leave, she felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of freedom. The day Maria left the Whitman estate, the staff gathered quietly to bid her farewell. Mrs. Alder hugged her tightly, whispering words of encouragement. Even Margaret, usually so critical, offered a reluctant nod of respect. As Maria stepped outside, her suitcase in hand, she paused to take one last look at the grand house that had been both a prison and a crucible. Then, with the sun warming her face and the promise of a new beginning ahead, she walked away without looking back. For Harold, it was the end of an era, a bitter reminder that power and control were not as absolute as he had believed. For Maria, it was the start of something far greater, a life defined not by servitude, but by possibility.